He humiliated her without remorse, thinking he would never have to worry about the consequences. But fate has a cruel way of getting revenge. Now, years later, the woman he once despised is the only one who can save his life. She holds in her hands the diagnosis that will decide whether he lives or dies. And one question lingers in the air: will her revenge come with a cure, or a sentence? Gustavo was a well-known name among the most exclusive circles of high society. At just 35 years old, he had solidified his position as one of the country's top entrepreneurs. His empire spanned various sectors: technology, real estate, and multi-million-dollar investments. He had it all: sports cars, mansions on 3 continents, parties filled with luxury, and influential connections. Gustavo was the perfect picture of success, at least on the outside. Over the years, Gustavo had distanced himself from his origins. His youth had been marked by an arrogance bordering on cruelty, especially towards those he considered inferior. He didn't remember names, only moments when he felt superior, leaving his mark on humiliations that, to him, were insignificant but had left deep scars on others, like Isabella. During college, Gustavo was the center of attention. Rich, intelligent, and sharp-tongued, he never missed an opportunity to mock anyone beneath his standard. Isabella, on the other hand, was a hard-working and shy student from a humble background, balancing her studies with 2 jobs to pay the bills. Despite everything, she carried a dream: to become a doctor. During a project presentation class, Gustavo had the chance to show his cruel side. Isabella, exhausted after another late night of work, made small mistakes in her explanation. Gustavo didn't hesitate to point out her slip-ups in a mocking way, drawing laughter from the other students. "If this is how you want to change the world, you'd better give up while you still can," he said with a contemptuous smile. To Gustavo, it was just a joke, but for Isabella, it was the most humiliating moment of her life. The episode deeply marked Isabella. Instead of giving up, she used that pain as fuel. Determined to surpass all expectations, she graduated with honors, earned scholarships, and became a brilliant doctor specializing in cardiology. Years later, Isabella was recognized for her dedication and empathy, always going the extra mile to care for her patients. Meanwhile, Gustavo continued his social rise, accumulating wealth and superficialities. However, his health began to show warning signs. Chest pains, dizziness, and constant exhaustion were ignored by him, attributing everything to work stress. "I am Gustavo Albuquerque, nothing can bring me down," he thought. But fate had other plans. One seemingly ordinary morning, Gustavo collapsed on the floor of his mansion, with excruciating chest pain. The emergency team was called, and he was rushed to the nearest hospital. Still unconscious, he had no idea that this would be the day his past would come back to confront him in a brutal way. When he finally opened his eyes in the emergency room, Gustavo felt the weight of his situation. But nothing could prepare him for what was about to come. The door opened, and a figure dressed in a white coat entered. Isabella held the clipboard firmly, her expression a mixture of professionalism and a gleam that he couldn't decipher immediately. She had changed. She was more mature, confident, but above all, she was the person he never expected to see at that moment. "Mr. Gustavo Albuquerque," she began, with a firm but calm voice. "I'm Dr. Isabella, and I'll be in charge of your case." Gustavo froze. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, he knew exactly who she was. The impact of the revelation left him speechless. There she was, the woman he had humiliated years ago, now holding in her hands the diagnosis that could determine his life. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Gustavo, the millionaire used to commanding boardrooms and subjugating adversaries, now felt small in the presence of Isabella. His mind was in shock, trying to process what had just happened. How had she, the woman he had ridiculed years ago, become the person responsible for deciding the course of his life? "We've met before, haven't we?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse and hesitant. Isabella stared at him for a moment before responding. "Yes, Mr. Albuquerque. But I don't think that's relevant right now. What matters now is your health." Her tone was neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of pain and determination, that Gustavo couldn't ignore. He tried to regain his composure, adjusting himself on the hospital bed. "All right, doctor. So, what's my diagnosis?" Isabella consulted the clipboard before speaking. "The initial tests indicate that you've had a heart attack. We'll need more tests to assess the extent of the damage and determine the most appropriate treatment." She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "For now, I recommend complete rest." Gustavo nodded, but couldn't stop staring at her. He wanted to say something, perhaps apologize or justify his past behavior, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was, for the first time, he felt vulnerable in a way that no amount of money could fix. Isabella, for her part, maintained a professional demeanor, but as she left the room, a whirlwind of emotions stirred within her. Seeing Gustavo in that condition had awakened painful memories, but also a strange sense of power. He now depended on her, the same person he had belittled so long ago. However, Isabella knew her duty was, above all, to save lives, no matter who the patient was. In the following hours, as Gustavo reflected alone in his room, flashes of his past began flooding his mind. He remembered all the times he had used his position to humiliate others, the way he treated his employees, and especially that day in college. For the first time, he began to question whether his vision of success was truly worth the price he was paying. The next day, Isabella returned to the room with the test results. "Mr. Albuquerque, the results confirmed that the attack was severe. We'll need to discuss surgical options and lifestyle changes." He nodded slowly, but before she could leave, he called her name. "Isabella." She stopped, turning to face him. "Yes? I'm sorry." The words came out hesitantly, but sincerely. "For everything. Especially for how I treated you in the past." Isabella was silent for a few seconds, surprised by the confession. Finally, she replied, "The past cannot be changed, Mr. Albuquerque. But the present can." And with that, she left the room, leaving Gustavo alone with his thoughts. Gustavo's pride, however, wouldn't allow him to dive too deep into that conversation. Despite his momentary regret, he still saw himself as superior. "I don't need her," he thought, even though the circumstances suggested otherwise. The next morning, Gustavo woke up to the sound of the medication cart entering the room. He still felt the weight of the confession he had made the previous day, but in his mind, his old arrogance was trying to rebuild itself as a shield against his vulnerability. After all, he was Gustavo Albuquerque, and no one had ever put him in such a fragile position. Until now. Isabella entered the room, holding her clipboard as always, with the same professional expression. But this time, there was something different in her gaze. Maybe it was the memory of Gustavo's words from the day before, or maybe she was deliberately holding back the hint of sarcasm that threatened to escape. "Good morning, Mr. Albuquerque. I hope you slept well, despite your condition," she said, with a slightly neutral tone that hid an almost imperceptible hint of sarcasm. Gustavo raised an eyebrow. "Slept well?" "Oh, of course, because the hospital is basically a luxury resort, isn't it, doctor?" Isabella gave a discreet smile but quickly returned to her serious tone. "Well, considering your life was saved here, maybe now isn't the ideal time for 5-star reviews on TripAdvisor." He let out a short, dry laugh. "Touché." But the truth was, Gustavo wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone like her. It bothered him, and at the same time, it made him respect her in a strange way. She moved closer, checking the monitors beside the bed. "If I may be direct, Mr. Albuquerque, your body has already shown clear signs that it can no longer keep up with the pace you've been maintaining. Your recovery will depend directly on serious lifestyle changes." Gustavo shook his head impatiently. More of the health sermon. "I got it, doctor. Less work, more vegetables, and walks in the park. Anything more cliché to add?" Isabella took a deep breath, and for the first time, let sarcasm take over. "Well, I'd also recommend fewer public humiliations and a little more humility." I've heard it does wonders for blood pressure. He blinked, surprised, but realized he couldn't retort. Isabella was facing him with a combination of intelligence and emotional control he never expected from someone he had treated with disdain years ago. You really don't let anything slide, do you? He said, trying to mask his discomfort with a smile. My job is to make sure you leave here alive, Mr. Albuquerque. And, if possible, with a new perspective on life. But the second part depends entirely on you, she replied, placing the clipboard on the holder and preparing to leave the room. Before she could go, Gustavo called her name. Wait. I have a question. Isabella stopped at the door, crossing her arms. Yes? He hesitated for a moment but decided to proceed. Do you feel some kind of pleasure in seeing me in this situation? Like a the world turns moment? Because, honestly, I think you have every reason to feel that way. Isabella raised an eyebrow, assessing the question. If you want the truth, Gustavo, yes, I feel something. But it's not pleasure. It's satisfaction in knowing that, even in the face of someone like you, my ethics and my commitment as a doctor remain intact. Because, contrary to what you believed in college, I'm so much more than your petty judgments. She paused dramatically, looking him directly in the eyes. But if that means you'll leave here a better person, who am I to judge? Without waiting for a response, Isabella left the room, leaving Gustavo alone with his thoughts. He felt a mix of frustration, admiration, and for the first time, real shame. Isabella was much stronger than he had ever imagined. And, worse still, she was right. Lying in bed, he looked at the ceiling, thinking about what she had just said. For the first time, he realized that her words carried more weight than any motivational speech he had ever heard in his business meetings. It wasn't just about health or regret. It was about rebuilding. Gustavo spent the rest of the day reflecting on the conversation with Isabella. There was something in the way she confronted him that left him unsettled. Not only did she not fear him, but she also seemed immune to the charm and power he had always used to assert himself over others. For the first time, he truly felt small in front of someone. In the late afternoon, a nurse entered to check his vital signs. Good afternoon, Mr. Albuquerque. How are you feeling today? Gustavo sighed, not feeling particularly enthusiastic about trivial conversation. Surviving, I guess. The nurse smiled faintly. That's a good start. You had a visit earlier, but you were sleeping. Your secretary left some documents and asked me to deliver them personally. He took the envelope the nurse handed him and opened it with indifference. Inside, there were contracts and reports from his company. Business that never stopped, even while he was lying in a hospital bed. For years, that had been his life: numbers, deals, power. But now, for the first time, the feeling he had while looking at those papers was one of exhaustion. As he flipped through the documents, a small note fell onto his lap. It was from his assistant, Clara. Gustavo. Things are under control here. Take care of yourself. Some appointments have been postponed, and the investors understand your situation. But maybe it's time to think beyond meetings and profits. You always say you're irreplaceable, but the truth is, no one is. And you are so much more than a CEO. Think about it. Clara. Gustavo furrowed his brow. He never imagined Clara had such a clear view of his life. He always saw her as efficient, practical, but never someone who would give him personal advice. What was happening? It seemed like everyone around him saw something he hadn't yet noticed. The next day, Isabella returned to his room, but this time, with a less rigid expression. Good morning, Mr. Albuquerque. How are you feeling today? He looked at her for a moment before responding. Reflective. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the honest answer. That's a first. Reflection doesn't seem like your favorite pastime. He smiled faintly. Apparently, a heart attack does that to a man. She checked his exams before responding. Good to know the scare is serving a purpose. Your vitals are stable, but you still need rest. And most importantly, you need to reconsider some choices. Gustavo took a deep breath. Were you always this direct? Or is this something new? She crossed her arms. Let's just say time has taught me not to waste words. You, more than anyone, should understand that. But tell me, why so reflective? Something happened? He hesitated for a moment before showing her Clara's note. My assistant sent me this. Looks like even she realized I was losing control of my life. Isabella quickly read the note and then handed it back. So, you've finally realized the world keeps turning even without you in charge. How does that make you feel? Gustavo laughed humorlessly. Terrified. But at the same time, relieved. Which is strange because I never thought I'd say something like that. She nodded, as if she expected that response. That's because you're starting to realize that your identity doesn't need to be tied to absolute control. There's more to life than business meetings and professional achievements. You just need to decide if you want to get to know it. He looked at her, trying to decipher something in her face. You speak as if you know exactly what I'm going through. Have you been in that place before? She hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to open up. But then she gave a small, sad smile. Maybe. Gustavo realized there was more behind Isabella's professional mask than he had imagined. For the first time, he felt a desire to really get to know her. Not as a challenge, but as someone who might teach him something he had never considered important, life beyond ambition. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest lesson he needed to learn. By the end of the week, Gustavo received the news that he was cleared to leave the hospital. The doctor gave him his final recommendations, stressing the importance of rehabilitation and taking care of his health. As he signed the discharge papers, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He was leaving physically better, but mentally still full of doubts. As he put on his clothes and looked at himself in the room's mirror, he realized he was no longer the same man who had walked in days ago. Something had changed. The weight of arrogance and pride seemed lighter. He grabbed his suitcase and headed toward the door, meeting Isabella in the hallway. So, finally free? She asked with a slight smile. He took a deep breath. Free. But where do I go now? She looked at him for a moment before responding. That's something only you can decide, Gustavo. But I hope you've learned that true freedom isn't in power or money. It's in the choices we make to truly live. He nodded, feeling those words would stay engraved in his mind. Without saying anything more, he crossed the hospital doors, ready to discover what his next step would be. The fresh air of the street hit Gustavo as soon as he walked through the hospital doors. The sun was shining brightly, and the city's buzz seemed louder than he remembered. After days of confinement, the world felt different, or maybe it was him who had changed. His driver was already waiting for him with his usual black car, impeccably clean. Gustavo hesitated before getting in. For the first time, the thought of returning to his luxurious penthouse seemed empty. What would he do when he got there? Review contracts? Watch economic news? All of that felt distant now. Sitting in the back seat, he looked at his phone, dozens of unread messages. Some from concerned partners, others from people who just wanted to maintain appearances. But no messages that really mattered. None that asked how he was doing for real. Do you want to go home, Mr. Albuquerque? The driver asked politely. He hesitated. No. Take me somewhere quiet. I need to think. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, surprised, but simply nodded. The car started, and Gustavo leaned back, feeling the weight of uncertainty. After a while, they reached a tree-lined park, away from the city's hustle and bustle. Gustavo got out of the car and walked slowly. The silence felt almost strange to him, used to the constant sound of keyboards, meetings, and ringing phones. He sat on a bench and watched the people around, children playing, couples walking hand in hand, elderly people chatting under the shade of trees. Ordinary people, living simple lives, without the weight of empires on their shoulders. An older woman sat beside him, adjusting a shopping bag on her lap. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she commented, without looking at him. Gustavo, used to being recognized anywhere, was surprised by how naturally she spoke to him, as if he were just another man in the park. "Yes, it's been a while since I noticed that." She laughed softly. "Life passes quickly when we don't pay attention. When my husband was alive, he always said we only realize the value of the little things when we almost lose them." Gustavo fell silent. That sentence hit him in an unexpected way. "You're right." She stood up with difficulty, grabbing her shopping bag. "Enjoy the sun, young man. It doesn't wait for anyone." He watched as she walked away, feeling a tightness in his chest. How many things had he let pass by? How many times had he ignored simple moments, obsessed with another victory in business? He picked up his phone and, impulsively, searched for a contact. Isabella's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, he hesitated. But then, he pressed the call button. She answered after a few rings. "Gustavo?" He took a deep breath. "I left the hospital. And I realized I don't know what to do now." She was silent for a moment before responding. "Maybe it's time to figure that out." "And how do I do that?" Isabella sighed on the other end of the line. "One step at a time." "Where do you want to start?" Gustavo looked around, absorbing the moment. "By paying attention to what I never did before." He didn't exactly know what that meant. But for the first time, he was willing to find out. Gustavo spent the following days trying to reconnect with himself. He started with small steps, walking without haste, observing the city with a different perspective, listening to the people around him without the urgency that always accompanied him. It was strange for someone who had always lived under the pressure of success and productivity. But, little by little, he began to notice something he had never seen before, the beauty of life without rushing. The feeling of freedom was both strange and welcome. He no longer needed to check emails every minute, nor did he need to give quick answers to every problem that arose. For the first time, he allowed himself the luxury of simply being present. During one of his walks, he found himself in front of a modest cafe, hidden among tall buildings. Something about the place caught his attention, perhaps the smell of fresh coffee or the soft laughter coming from inside. Without thinking much, he entered and chose a table near the window. A waitress approached, smiling kindly. "Good morning. What would you like?" He hesitated. For years, his coffee had come from the company's coffee machine, hurriedly prepared. "What do you recommend?" She laughed. "Our house special coffee. It has a touch of vanilla and a secret only the owner knows." Gustavo nodded. "Then I'll have that." While waiting, he observed the customers around him. Workers, students, couples. All living their lives, each at their own pace. Why had he never noticed this before? When the cup arrived, he took a sip and closed his eyes for a moment. The flavor was smooth, different from what he was used to. It was comforting. As if, for the first time, he could just be there, without worries, without hurry. The doorbell rang, and a familiar voice caught his attention. He looked up and saw Isabella entering, surprised to see him there. "Gustavo? What are you doing here?" He smiled slightly. "Trying to figure out how to live without rushing so much." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "And how's that going?" He looked at the cup and then at her. "It still feels strange. But for the first time, I think I'm on the right track." Isabella smiled. "Then maybe it's a good start." The conversation flowed naturally. Isabella shared about her intense routine at the hospital, but also about her moments of pause, about how she found small ways to slow down amidst the chaos. Gustavo listened attentively, absorbing every word. When the waitress brought another coffee for Isabella, she raised her cup in a symbolic gesture. "To a new beginning?" He smiled, raising his own cup. "To a new beginning." And, for the first time in years, he truly believed it. In the following days, Gustavo felt that something inside him was changing. He started noticing small details he had previously ignored, like the wind rustling through the trees, people walking leisurely along the sidewalks, and even the waitress's smile when she served him coffee every morning. The world seemed to have a different rhythm, and he was learning to keep pace with it. He decided it was time to face a part of his past that he had left behind. He picked up the phone and, after a few minutes of hesitation, dialed a familiar number. The voice on the other end answered with surprise. "Gustavo? After all this time, I didn't expect you to call." It was Leonardo, his former business partner, and at one point, his best friend. They had broken ties years ago when Gustavo decided to go solo, prioritizing profits over the partnership they had built. "I need to talk to you, man. Can we meet?" There was a brief silence before the response. "All right. Tomorrow, at the same bar as always?" The next night, Gustavo arrived at the bar and felt a wave of nostalgia. The atmosphere was the same as it had been years ago, but he was not. He sat down and waited. When Leonardo walked in, Gustavo noticed that time had changed them both. His former partner seemed more at ease, less burdened by the rush of business. They stared at each other for a moment before Leonardo broke the silence. "You seem different." Gustavo smiled slightly. "Life has a funny way of teaching us things. I think I'm finally learning." The conversation started out tense but soon became more natural. Gustavo apologized for what had happened in the past, admitting that he had been driven by greed and arrogance. Leonardo listened attentively and, to Gustavo's surprise, bore no ill will. "I've moved on, Gustavo. But I'm glad you realized it. It's never too late to change." They toasted, not only to the reunion but also to the growth they had both experienced. Gustavo felt that this was another step in the journey that had begun since he left the hospital. As he left the bar, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he looked to the future without the anxiety he had once carried. He didn't know exactly where this new path would lead him, but for the first time, he was willing to follow it without fear. The days passed, and Gustavo felt increasingly renewed. He had reconnected with old friends, rediscovered simple pleasures in life, and learned that true success wasn't just about money, but about human connections and balance. One peaceful morning, he decided to do something he had been putting off for years: visit his mother. It had been a long time since he had last been there, always busy with business and commitments. When he arrived at her house, he felt a lump in his throat. He knocked on the door, and when she opened it, his mother looked at him, surprised, but with a gleam in her eyes. "Son. You came." Gustavo smiled, feeling warmth in his chest. "Yes, Mom. I needed to come." They spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. It was in that simple moment that he realized how much he had lost while chasing something that would never bring him true happiness. Over time, Gustavo began using his experience to help others. He created an organization for entrepreneurs who, like him, had lost their way in the pursuit of success and needed to find balance again. He shared his story, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. And in doing so, he felt more fulfilled than at any other time in his life. On the last night of the year, Gustavo looked out at the illuminated city, feeling grateful. He was no longer the arrogant man blinded by power. He was someone who finally understood the value of time, people, and life. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more transformative content, subscribe to the channel. Let's go on this journey of learning and growth together.